The Lights of Avalon, Chapter 1, Prologue. And so it begins.
Hey, Jack? Can you tell me a story?
Certainly, my good lord, O honorable, noble, stunning Hiccup.
You're hilarious.
Sorry. Yes, what kind of story?
Maybe one with magic and adventure. One of love and loss. Of second chances and new beginnings. Does that make sense?
Then I know the perfect one to tell.
Oh, do you now?
Of course. This is the story of us. Chapter 2. A Hero is Reborn, Part 1. There he drew forth the brand Excalibur, and o'er him, drawing it, the winter moon, brightening the skirts of a long cloud, ran forth, and sparkled keen with frost against the hilt. For all the haft twinkled with diamond sparks, myriads of topaz lights and jacinth's work of subtlest jewelry. From Alfred Lord Tennyson, Idylls of the King. The legend of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table was Jack's favorite fairy tale to tell the children of his village. Although he never bothered to read deeply into the books, he preferred to make up his own twists and turns in the story instead. He loved to make children laugh, to hear them gasp when he told them of Sir Gawaine's brush with death against the Green Knight, and melt their hearts when he told them of Sir Yvain's friendship with the lion. Most of all, he loved the way their eyes would light up when he spoke of Merlin and the magic that was once abundant in this world. Some of the adults would complain about the accuracy of his stories, and Jack probably wasn't helping his case with the pranks he pulled in the process of telling them. One time he rigged some watering cans to shower the audience as the special effects for a magic spell. He had miscalculated how much water the trick would require, though, and ended up drenching one parent from head to toe before the can crashed down on them as well. If the kids didn't get such a good laugh out of it, then he might have even felt a bit bad about how funny it was to him. All in all, Jack paid his critics no mind. At the very least, he told the story better than these guys.
"Who dares trespass on these holy lands to the sacred tower?"
wheezed a voice that was desperately forcing itself down from a higher pitch.
"'Tis I, Sir Galahad," boomed another, "the most noble knight of Camelot. I come in search of thy chalice of life on behalf of the king."
Jack stood among the small audience, watching the disaster of a show unfold before him, while doing his best not to chuckle out loud. Up on a makeshift stage stood 3 bards, a tall man and a short woman performing in front of the hastily set-up curtain, and the shortest man behind it casting shadow puppets as their set dressing and special effects. The woman who played the Fisher King, the guardian of the chalice, was hunched over, covered in a large brown cloak, and holding a mop to her face as her beard. The tall man on stage with her had an old towel tied around his neck as a cape, holding a wooden sword in one hand and a stick with a stuffed toy horse head attached to the end in the other.
"Very well, then," said the woman in her old man voice. "You may pass, but be warned, only those with the purest, kindest, most chivalrous hearts may lay hands on the chalice." She gestured to the curtain, wiggling her fingers and singing in a one-woman choir. There was a loud cranking noise, then up rose the projected shadow of a crudely cut up. "What will you do next, O noble knight?" A curtain of brown hair covered Jack's view of what exactly Galahad did next.
"I like our version better,"
whispered a voice above him. Jack snickered, looking up at the upside-down smiling face of his sister. He adjusted his hold on Emily so that her sudden maneuver wouldn't send her toppling off his shoulders. "Careful now, you might hurt their feelings if they hear you," he whispered back.
"I'm sure they can handle a little bit of constructive feedback from the experts,"
said Emily while stifling her giggles. Jack smirked. He shrugged, exaggerating the motion so that she was jostled around. She laughed and clung onto him tighter. I don't know. I'm having a good time watching them," he replied. As if on cue, there was a loud thudding sound, followed by a string of curses from the tall man. Bunny, Jack remembered from their introduction. And the woman was Tooth, and the shorter man was Sandy. Strange choice of stage names for even stranger people.
"You should join them then. I think the fluffy head would suit you."
"I can and will drop you right now." Emily stuck her tongue out at him and sat back up. Jack blew the last couple strands of her hair out of his face, clearing his view of the performance again. And right on time. Bunny was too lost in his monologue, something about Lancelot returning to King Arthur from the Chalice quest empty-handed, to notice that Sandy, fittingly, had given him large puppet shadow bunny ears. It wasn't until some of the younger children in the audience pointed and laughed that Bunny snapped out of his focus. He whipped around, accidentally smacking Tooth in the face with his cape, who stumbled back into the curtain, knocking it down and Sandy with it. Bunny ran to steady Tooth, but slipped on said curtain, and the three of them crashed into a heap on the stage. The crowd murmured in concern at the scene, but not nearly as loudly as the guffaw that would have exploded out of Jack had Emily not slapped her hands over his mouth. His shoulders shook from the effort to muffle his cackling, and Emily along with him.
"Come on," she snickered. "Let's go before you hurt their feelings."
Still chortling, Jack let her down and grabbed their basket of fresh bread and vegetables off the ground. The two of them snuck past the rest of the crowd, hurrying to get far enough away where the laughter couldn't be heard. Jack and Emily made their way through the cobblestone streets of the town market, nearly finished with their shopping for the day. The last stop was the apothecary to pick up supplies for their mother's patients. They workshopped their own version of the search for the chalice of life along their walk. Inspired by the bard's performance, which was even more tragic than the story itself, they picked and chose what ideas they enjoyed from them and weaved them into the tale. Or at least Emily did.
"Jack, you can't just keep setting characters on fire whenever you run out of ideas,"
Emily laughed. "Why not?" Jack grinned back.
"Because it's not good storytelling."
"Maybe so." Jack poked her in the stomach, making her giggle. "But it's a crowd pleaser."
"Yeah, when the crowd's all 6 years old,"
Emily snickered. Jack pursed his lips, pretending to be deep in thought, then nodded. "You're right. Next time I'll freeze them all in a block of ice, like an adult." They were interrupted by a group of children, waving at them, clamoring for Jack's attention. Jack recognized them. Alice, Dora, and Walter, as he did with all the kids in the village. It was getting late in the afternoon, and they needed to hurry before the shop closed, but Jack couldn't help stopping to play with them. He never got tired of the children, nor the look on Emily's face while she played with them too. She made fun of him the whole time, saying how she didn't know why they all fawned over a giant goof like him, but the way her eyes shined only spoke of her pride in her big brother. But after he finished entertaining the group, he realized he had lost track of her. Jack found her looking into the window of a clothing store. "What you looking at, kiddo?" He walked up to her. He followed her gaze to a pink dress hanging on one of the mannequins. Emily jumped and made a show of looking around the rest of the shop before turning back to him, smiling a little too innocently.
"Are you done?"
she asked. Jack frowned, glancing down at their own modest clothing of white shirts and brown vests. Emily's skirt used to be navy color that had long since faded into dull baby blue. He was suddenly aware of how much lighter than usual the coin purse was in his pocket. Seeming to read his thoughts, Emily bumped his arm.
"Come on, the shop's right around the corner,"
she said, grabbing his hand and pulling him away. Jack shook his head fondly. At the very least, he had managed to scrounge up enough change through some odd jobs around town to buy her something special for her next birthday. But now he would have to spend the next couple of weeks budgeting the rest of their savings as the winter months hit. They got to the apothecary a few minutes before closing and hastily gathered everything their mother had written on the list. Emily insisted on holding the entire load in her arms, and Jack and the clerk both laughed at how she had to stand on her toes to put everything on the counter. Jack stopped laughing when he went to pay. He realized why his coin purse had felt so light before. It was gone. He pulled the pockets out of his pants, trying not to panic. That was the rest of the budget for the week. He locked eyes with Emily. "I probably lost it during the show." Emily gave him a salute.
"I'll distract her while you go look for it."
"It's not a distraction when you say the plan right in front of her." Jack laughed. The clerk gave the two of them a patient smile.
"It's all right. I don't mind closing a little late today."
Jack thanked her and rushed out the door. The sun was setting over the village by the time Jack tracked down the bard troop. They were packing up their equipment for the day, loading it up into the large red carriage under the shade of some trees. Or at least that's what they appeared to have been doing before getting swarmed by a crowd of children. Jack paused, perplexed. Bunny had a child hanging off each arm, another crawling her way up his back, yanking at his hair. Tooth was bent over, chattering while holding out something in her hands to another two. Wait, were those teeth? Judging by the kids' alarmed looks, Jack assumed that it wasn't too wild of a guess. The rest of the group stood in a circle, kicking some of Sandy's puppets to each other in a game to keep them in the air, while Sandy ran around catching the ones that fell to the ground. The kids were all poking fun at them, but the weird thing was, all 3 bards seemed to be enjoying it just as much as they were. Jack felt himself grin. Then he remembered what he was here for. One of the kids spotted him jogging closer to the group.
"It's Jack!"
he yelled, and all at once the horde of kids ran over to him. Jack felt a wide smile split his face, followed by a laugh when they all tackled him into a hug.
"Where's Emily? Are you guys done shopping? Can you play with us?"
"Sorry, everyone, I'm strictly here for business," Jack said, wagging a finger in the air in mock seriousness. "Besides, shouldn't you all be heading home before dark?" A loud groan passed over the kids.
"Since when were you so responsible with curfews?"
asked one of the younger girls, Isabel. "Since now that I've been seen with you, I'll be implicated in the crime if anyone goes missing," Jack replied. Isabel still pouted. Jack sighed, kneeling down so that he was level with her. "Tell you what, be good now, and tomorrow I'll tell you what really happened to Sir Galahad after he touched the chalice. Sound good?" Isabel grinned and nodded. Jack winked and ruffled her hair, making her giggle. That pacified the rest of the kids too, and one by one they said their goodbyes to Jack before heading off. Jack was still grinning as the last child left. Feeling 3 pairs of eyes on his back, he turned to face the bards. Now that he was up close, and they were out of costume, he got a better look at them. Tooth had the most colorful outfit of the 3, with large baggy teal pants tapered into knee-high boots. She wore a matching teal vest that had a train in the back, the color gradiating to indigo towards the bottom. The purple long sleeve she wore underneath had gold trim on both the collar and cuffs. The cooler colors complemented her warm brown skin tone and long dark hair. Sandy was in all yellow, with striped tights and a button-down shirt with poofy sleeves and a pattern of semicircles at the bottom edge, tied in the middle with a belt and satchel. His blonde hair was styled in a way reminiscent of a 5-pointed star. He had decorative tasseled shoulder pieces and a dark gold-colored scarf tucked into his shirt. The clothes were all tailor-fit, accentuating his round figure. The 2 of them were tiny compared to Bunny. He was even taller than Jack had realized, his own head only just clearing his shoulders. He was dressed in a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, showing off large triangular tattoos running up his tan arms. He wore a lavender vest over it and matching pants, a green sash draped from across one shoulder to his opposite hip. His dark brown hair was brushed back out of his face, showing gray streaks that extended into his large sideburns and even his bushy eyebrows. They all wore variations of the same large-brimmed hat, each one with a feather that was color-coordinated with their outfits. Tooth's was particularly ostentatious, adorned in teal and gold feathers, which the one large feather of the second color standing proudly in the air. All of them were staring at Jack with a strange look in their eyes that was almost like approval. There was a beat of silence. Jack cleared his throat, holding out his hand in greeting. "Hi, name's Jackson Overland, but you can call me Jack. We haven't met officially, but I was in the audience at your last show." Being closest to him, Bunny was the first to saunter over with his chest puffed out and shoulders squared. "Bunny," he introduced himself, giving Jack a lopsided smile. He had a strange accent that Jack couldn't place. He seemed to notice how far back Jack had to tilt his head to look up at him, and smirked as he took his hand. "Pleasure to meet ya." Jack's eyes narrowed. He pressed his lips together, but he couldn't stop the elfish smile from curling onto his face. "Don't say it, don't say it. So why Bunny as a name? Stop talking, seeing as you're not exactly, tiny, fluffy, or cute." "Well," he tried. Bunny's smile dropped so fast it looked like someone manually yanked down the corners of his mouth. He leaned down to meet Jack's eyes. "I'll have you know, I'm downright adorable," he said through gritted teeth. Oh, he was going to be a fun one. A tiny fist appeared from behind Bunny and bonked him on the head. He grunted in annoyance and stepped aside to reveal Tooth and Sandy perched on the edge of the carriage, the latter being the culprit.
"Play nice, Bunny,"
Tooth joked before looking at Jack. Her eyes were a vibrant shade of blue, nearly indigo.
"Great to meet you, Jack. I go by Tooth, and this is Sandy."
Sandy gave a flamboyant bow in greeting, balancing his tiny feet on the railing. Jack grinned and bowed back.
"So,
he said, clapping his hands together. "Sorry to keep you even longer, but I'm looking for my coin purse, and I was wondering if you happened to see one lying around after your, performance." Jack tried to keep from smirking at that last word. Judging by Bunny's scowl, he didn't do a good job. "You got something to say about it, kid?" Bunny asked. "I might have a few notes." "What are they? How much time you got?" Tooth giggled, and Bunny shot her a look. Sandy patted his head soothingly from where he sat, and Bunny shooed his hand away.
"Sandy's right, Bunny. Audience feedback is very important. And you've got to admit, it was an itty little bit of a gigantic wreck. No need to get uppity about it," Tooth said. She had an upbeat way of speaking that was borderline frantic. Her dainty hands flitted around as she gestured around the group, including everyone in conversation as her words rushed out of her, like all the world was an auction and she was the bid caller. "We're out of time to workshop today, though. We'll keep working at it later." Sandy nodded in agreement, his serene demeanor in stark contrast to her energy, while Bunny rolled his eyes. Jack smiled genuinely this time. The bards had a bizarre mix of personalities, but they were clearly best friends despite the differences. In fact, they seemed closer for it. Jack decided he liked them. Tooth turned to him. "In answer to your question, we stole it."
"Never mind."
"You were pickpocketing the audience?"
Jack asked, his eyebrows shooting up.
"No, just you."
"What?"
"Oh, don't worry."
Tooth waved her hands, tone still chipper.
"We were always going to give it back. We just wanted to meet you."
Jack shook his head, bewildered. Why? Admittedly, he was impressed, too. All three of them had been on stage the whole show. He couldn't remember at what point they would have had an opening to rob him. It must have been when Emily had covered his eyes, but that was only for a short minute. And how? Tooth shrugged.
"We have our ways."
Sandy waved to get Jack's attention. He stuck his hands into his satchel and pulled out 4 finger puppets. 3 on one hand, each with a little hat corresponding with the bard's own colors, and 1 on the other with a tuft of brown hair on its head and a large smile drawn on its face. He wiggled the 4th one at Jack. Jack blinked at it. "Is that supposed to be me?" he asked. Sandy nodded, then brought his hands together, placing tiny Jack next to the rest of them. "You want me to join you?" Sandy nodded again. Jack huffed a laugh. "You've got to be joking," he muttered, glancing at the other 2. Tooth was leaning forward in anticipation, while Bunny had a disgruntled look on his face, but both of them appeared to be in agreement. "Why me?" he asked again. "That's what I'm wondering, too," Bunny grumbled, then jumped when Sandy bonked him again. "Sandy, I swear, if you do that one more time—"
"You have a way with kids, Jack."
Tooth cut him off.
"It's adorable how much fun they have when you're playing with them. We could use someone like you, and you're obviously already familiar with the material."
"So you did hear that earlier, huh?" Jack smirked. "Familiar is generous depending on who you ask. Kids usually like it when I make the characters explode. And thanks, but I've got a pretty good thing going on where I am. Plus, I don't think I'd exactly—" He made a point to look over all their outfits. "Fit in?" He made eye contact with Bunny when he said that, taking great satisfaction in how red his face was turning. Tooth looked like she expected his answer, still holding her arms out in welcome.
"We'll be here if you ever change your mind."
"Sure." Jack held out his hand. "Now, my purse, if you would." Sandy pulled the small bag out of his satchel. He tossed it to Bunny, who held it out to Jack. Jack reached for it, but at the last moment, Bunny raised it high above his head, leaving him to grasp at nothing but air. Jack glowered at him. Now it was Bunny's turn to smirk. "I don't know if I will," he replied. They faced off for a moment. Then Jack burst into action. He leapt off one of the crates, springboarding off it, and made to grab for the purse. To his surprise, Bunny reacted immediately, making a show of twirling away. Jack almost crashed into the carriage, but managed to grab onto the handle of one of the doors, planting his feet to the side to hang off of it. Tooth and Sandy hardly reacted to the harsh way the carriage swayed, keeping their balance, even with Sandy standing up on the railing. Jack furrowed his brows. Where did the sudden grace come from? This didn't match the image he had formed of the bumbling bard trio, tripping over their own feet on the flat floor of the stage. Bunny turned back to him, all his earlier smugness returned in full. Jack deadpanned. "How much longer is this going to take? My sister's waiting for me." "Well, that depends on you, doesn't it?" Jack wasn't about to let that slide. Channeling his 17 years of tree climbing experience, He countered that one time he crawled onto a stump as a toddler. Jack returned Bunny's smirk with his own elfish grin and launched himself off the door. Bunny crouched down before backflipping onto another crate, and Jack couldn't help but admire his skill. He broke his fall by rolling into a crouch on the ground, then sprung at him again. Tooth and Sandy cheered them on as the two continued their show, Sandy pulling out two comically large wooden hands to clap together, and Jack would have been lying if he said he wasn't having a blast. It looked like the feeling was mutual with Bunny, whose smirk had given way to a genuine grin as they weaved and whirled around each other. Finally, Jack snagged the victory. Bunny had jumped away from one of Jack's dives and was backed up near a large maple tree, glancing behind him when his foot made contact with one of its roots. Seeing his opening, Jack leapt off the ground straight at him. Bunny looked back at him just in time, eyes widening. He ducked, leaving Jack flying directly at the trunk. Doing a flip in the air, Jack planted his feet against the tree and pushed backwards off of it. Bunny stood up right as Jack sailed over him. With one hand, Jack pulled the brim of Bunny's hat down over his eyes, the other he used to push off of his shoulder, landing on the ground in front of him. Bunny cursed, stumbling backwards. Jack took the opportunity to swipe his purse out of his hand, then grabbed his arm to steady him. Bunny righted himself with Jack's help, then lifted the brim of his hat. There was newfound respect in his eyes, albeit a little begrudging. "Not bad," he said. Jack grinned. "Not bad yourself." Tooth and Sandy jumped up and down in the carriage, Tooth squealing while Sandy went wild, clapping the big wooden hands. Jack laughed and bowed to his audience. "Well, it's been fun, but I should get back. My sister's probably getting worried."
"Oop, wait."
Tooth held a finger up. She reached into the carriage and pulled out a few coins.
"Here, for your troubles."
She did a trick where she rolled them down her knuckles before flipping them into the air towards Jack. Jack was again surprised by the sudden elegance in her actions, barely reacting in time to catch them. He glanced at the amount, and his eyes widened. These were all silver pieces, enough to comfortably get his family through the oncoming winter, even after his rather expensive purchase. He sent her a smile. "Thank you," he said genuinely.
"Not a problem at all."
She leaned closer and covered her mouth in mock secrecy.
"I took it out of Bunny's share."
"You what?" Bunny's protest was cut short by Sandy shoving a puppet into his mouth, giving Jack a thumbs up. Jack took that as his cue to leave. "Enjoy the rest of your stay in Hawthorne," he called over his shoulder, running away before Bunny could challenge him to a rematch. He found Emily back at the apothecary, chattering away at the poor clerk, waiting to finally close shop. As Jack got closer, he could hear that she was telling the woman her own version of King Arthur's love triangle with Lancelot and Guinevere. He smiled to himself. Emily spotted him and hopped off the counter.
"What took you so long? I was almost finished with the whole story."
"No, she wasn't," the clerk said, while putting her face in her hands. Jack laughed and paid for their order, adding a tip for her patience. "Come on," he said to Emily. "We'll come up with an entertaining excuse for Mom on the way back." Emily grinned up at him.
"I already have a few ideas in mind," she said.
"Oh, do you now?" Jack held out his hand. "Let's hear 'em." Emily hugged his arm, and the two made their way back home.
"There's the castle, between those mountains."
Jack squinted at the vague smudges in the distance. "Which ones?"
"The pointier ones,"
Emily insisted from above him, sitting with her feet dangling over the side of a branch. Leaning forward as far as she could without falling off, she pointed her finger as if casting a spell to light up the horizon. Jack stood up on his own branch, holding onto the trunk of the tree as he tried to follow her directions. "You sure those aren't more mountains?"
"I'm pretty sure. It's hard to see in the dark."
Emily shrugged. Jack chuckled, leaning back against the tree to wait for nightfall. Whenever the day was clear enough, the two of them would climb up the tallest pine tree on the highest hill near their house at twilight, then watch as the sky filled with stars. He was always amazed by how large the world around them was whenever they came up here, admiring the view of the rich forests framed by magic mountain peaks. He closed his eyes and breathed in the fresh air as a breath of wind passed them by, already feeling the crisp cold of winter in it. He imagined himself being carried off with the breeze, flying over the largest lake in the land to their east, stretching endlessly into the distance. Then he'd fly back into the west, to the kingdom of Berg. It was too far for the eye to see from Hawthorne, but it didn't hurt to imagine you could.
"What do you think it looks like?"
Emily asked. Jack opened his eyes again. "Probably big and dark, with lots of spikes and a giant moat of black goo." Jack replied. Emily scrunched up her nose.
Blah, that's no fun. Who'd want that?
I don't know, but the people there are pretty tough. They have a lot of different customs than what we're used to.
Like what?
Jack raised a brow at her. Well, I've heard that they do a little dance before gobbling down the bones of the slain enemies. They're so strong that they use spears as arrows and ride horses upside down while holding their shields with their feet to hide from catapults, and sleep on beds of lit coals to become fireproof. And apparently all the parents give their kids really weird names because it's said that they scare off gnomes and trolls. She gave him a look.
Now you're just making things up.
Maybe some of it. All right, most of it, but that last part is true. Emily laughed. She swung off her branch onto Jack's, taking a seat next to him. She was getting more and more comfortable maneuvering through the trees thanks to his tutelage. He felt a swell of pride in his chest, pulling her closer and hugging an arm around her. Emily leaned into him, swinging her legs back and forth, gazing out across the lake.
Do you really think Avalon is out there? She asked.
Jack turned his attention to the lake as well. The last light of day had finally given way to the moonlight. It reflected off the surface of the calm waters, blanketing the land in a soft white glow.
No doubt about it, he replied. How can you be so sure?
Jack shrugged.
Why wouldn't it be? Who's to say that there isn't still magic out there, waiting to be discovered again?
Emily's eyes softened.
You sound like Dad.
Jack smiled. I think you mean Dad sounded like me, he said, grinning wider when Emily snorted. He looked back up at the night sky. Besides, you can't tell me you don't feel magic in this world when you look up at the stars. The two of them sat in silence as, one by one, the lights in the sky appeared. The North Star broke through the darkness first, opening the way for other pinlights and spotlights until they were forming drawings of peoples and creatures from myth. They played a game where they'd race each other to spot the different constellations, whoever found the next one first getting to tell a story about the character. They played this game until Emily started yawning. Jack decided it was time to call it a night when she almost nodded off while still sitting in the tree.
Come on, little flea, I'll race you down.
Emily's eyes popped back open.
You're on, she said, vaulting to a lower branch.
Hey, Jack laughed, rushing after her. He wasn't going to let her win just because he was older. The two of them scrambled their way down the tree, laughing and teasing the other for how slow they were. Jack ended up winning in the end, but only because his foot slipped on his last branch. He yelped and tumbled the rest of the way down, breaking his fall in a bush. He could hear Emily's laugh ringing down from above him. He sat up and brushed the twigs out of his hair, laughing with her. I won, he yelled, although it came out garbled as he spat leaves out of his mouth. He was about to whoop in victory when he heard rustling coming from the woods behind him.
Jack?
Emily called down. Jack didn't reply. He stood up slowly, careful not to make a sound, straining his ears to catch any more movement. They were still close to town, so they wouldn't be in danger of wolves or other large predators. More likely than not, it was a startled rabbit. Something wasn't sitting right with him, though. He heard another whisper of air behind him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Emily jumped to the ground, grabbing his hand and hiding behind him.
What was that? She whispered.
I don't know, Jack whispered back, pulling her closer. Let's head back before we find out. Emily nodded and let him lead him to the path home. They walked in silence for the rest of the trip, listening for any more sounds. It seemed like whatever they had felt had stayed behind. Just as they made it out of the woods, a gust of wind blew through the trees, making Emily jump. She trembled, clinging closer to Jack. Don't worry, he squeezed her hand. I'm here. Your big brother will protect you. Emily looked up at him, and he gave her a smile. After a moment, she smiled back. Little by little, Jack watched her relax again. Winter had always been Jack's favorite season. Where others saw only cold and dark, Jack saw beauty. He saw the snowy wonderland as a blank canvas waiting for him to fill with sculptures and drawings. He saw the lake freeze over into a new playground for children to skate. He saw the earth hold its breath in anticipation for renewal, the melting ice watering the ground for seeds to blossom into flowers. Jack loved winter for its endless potential for fun. But most importantly, winter was the season Emily was born. Jack was 6 years old when he held her for the first time, the tired parents smiling while watching them. She opened her eyes to him, and they were big and round, a rich hazel in color, matching Jack's own. Seeing a different face in her mother's, she began to cry.
It's okay. I'm your big brother, Jack said. He rocked her back and forth for a long time, until at last she quieted down, peering up at him curiously. Jack grinned. There you go. You'll be safe with me. I promise. I'll always be here to protect you. From then on, Jack counted his years and winters. It was one winter later when Emily took her first steps. Jack held her hand, guiding her the whole time. 4 winters later, Emily first made friends with the other children in the village. Jack had been there to introduce them, acting as a mediator until Emily felt comfortable enough to play with them on her own. After 6 winters, Emily climbed her first tree. Jack had caught her when she slipped on her way down, spraining his ankle but saving her in the process. It was 9 winters later when their father passed away. They held each other as they cried. Throughout all her life, every time she was scared, Jack would be there to brighten her skies. He would never get tired of how her eyes would light up each time he chased the monsters away, filled with belief in a happier tomorrow. And now in her 11th winter, she had that same scared look out on the frozen lake, wearing her new skates that Jack had bought for her birthday. She was standing in the center of a spiderweb of cracks in the ice. It's okay, Jack said, his own skates already taken off. Don't look down, just look at me. Jack, I'm scared, she whimpered.
I know. Jack's mind was racing. The cold of the ice stung at his feet like a bed of needles, but he couldn't afford to think about that. He couldn't afford to think about anything other than Emily. But you're going to be all right. You're not going to fall in. We're going to have a little fun instead.
No, we're not.
Would I trick you?
Yes, you always play tricks.
Well, not this time. Jack met her hazel eyes with his own. I promise you're going to be okay, but you have to believe in me. Emily held his gaze for a long moment. Then she took a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. Those same hazel eyes filled once again with belief in her big brother, and Jack knew he would protect her again.
Jack!
Emily's voice was the last thing he heard before he fell into the water. He thought the ice had been cold under his feet, but this was next-level freezing, like he was being stabbed from all sides at once. The shock of it made him gasp, instantly regretting it when the water flooded his throat. He coughed out more of his precious air, instinctively breathing in, only to fill his lungs more and more. Panic set in, replacing any and all good cheer from moments earlier when he had distracted Emily with a game of hopscotch. He was glad she couldn't see him now, and his utter terror after saving her from this fate. He thrashed in the water, desperately trying to swim back to the surface, but his soaked clothes clung onto him, weighing on him like 1,000 hands dragging him back down into the depth. Frostbite stung at his limbs, and his movements slowed as he lost feeling in them. He felt the water in his lungs freezing from the inside as well, the burning cold spreading to meet its external counterpart. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. Time stood still as he grew more and more tired. Finally, he coughed out his last breath and let himself sink. He could still hear Emily calling his name, her voice muffled by the water. She was safe. That was enough for him. He took one last glimpse of the moon, then dark spots overtook his vision. He closed his eyes. The first thing he heard was the wind in the trees. It shook the leaves, gliding over the grass and rustling the brush. It caressed his face as it passed him by. Jack blinked his eyes open. There were stars in the sky. When had it turned to night? Another gentle breeze passed by him, flying out over the lake and sending ripples through the water. The water? Jack sat up with a jolt. That's right, he was drowning, or had been drowning. Did he drown? Was he dead? Jack pinched his arm. No, that still hurt. Then he realized that his shirt was dry, and so were the rest of his clothes. But his throat was sore, probably from all that water he had choked on. He was alive. Thoroughly confused, he took in his surroundings. He was back by the lake, sitting at the edge of the woods that framed it, surrounded by flowers. There wasn't a speck of snow in sight, despite it being late December, only a light fog. The leaves of the large willow trees were in full bloom, hanging into the open water. Moonlight reflected off of its surface, illuminating a figure of a woman sitting on a stone further down by the shore. Jack wasn't eager to go any closer to the lake, but he needed answers. He got up, amazed by the lack of cold in his limbs, and walked closer to her. Even sitting down, Jack could tell that she was at least a good head or so taller than him. She wore a flowing dress that glimmered bright in the moonlight, but whose color Jack couldn't quite place. Flowers adorned her hair, water lilies, he recognized, tied to long strands with ribbons that draped all the way down to the ground. "Hello?" he said. The woman turned to face him. Her features were soft, with high cheekbones and a delicately hooked nose, and eyes that were a strange shade of blue-green. "Hello, Jack." Jack tensed. "How did you know my name?" he demanded, the words coming out hoarse. The woman gave him a small smile. "I visit the shoreline often," she explained, "and I've been watching you and your sister for a while now. That was a very brave thing you did for her." Jack searched her expression. He felt like he should be more concerned by what she meant when she said, "watching them," but nothing about her felt malicious in intent. There was an air of calm around her, a quiet dignity as peaceful as still water, and just like still water, it seemed to reflect back on him. Still, he kept his guard up. "Oh, thanks," was his eloquent reply. "Wait, you saw that too?" The woman nodded. "Were you the one that saved me?" She nodded again. "But—" Jack glanced at her clothes and hair, which were just as dry as his own. Her dress was far too thin to be wearing in winter, let alone while swimming in the water of a frozen lake. And yet here they both were. "How?" Jack felt his shoulders relax, his apprehension giving way to curiosity. He stood up straight, tilting his head. "Who are you?" The woman didn't answer. She reached behind her and pulled something out from behind the stone. She turned and held it out to Jack. A sheathed sword in a plain wooden scabbard. "What's this?" "A gift," the woman replied, although Jack got the feeling this was one he couldn't refuse. After some hesitation, he took the sword into his hands. He ran his hand along the scabbard, feeling the fine polish of the dark wood. He looked up. The woman was still watching him expectantly. "All right, then," Jack said slowly. Ever so carefully, he unsheathed the blade. It slid out of the scabbard with a soft rasp of smooth metal, the sound resonating through the quiet night. He turned it back and forth, examining it. The blade was long and straight, sharp on both sides, the end rounded out before the tip. The hilt and rain guard were a brass color, with one smooth gray gemstone embedded in the pommel. It was a simple sword, but finely crafted, its contours shining elegantly. Suddenly he felt a thrum of energy course from where he held it, traveling through his arm and directly into his chest. It felt like his heart was being lit on fire. He gasped, or tried to, but the breath was sucked out of his lungs, coming out in a large whoosh. He tried to drop the sword, but his arm was stuck in place. He had to hold it in both hands to stop from shaking. He stared at the blade, seeing the terror in his eyes reflected back at him. Then his eyes changed. From the iris burst a piercing blue color, spreading out from the center and overtaking his hazel. He cried out. There was a flash of light, and Jack was blown back onto the ground. The sword fell point first into the grass, landing so that it stood upright. The gem in the pommel glowed, and Jack watched it become the blue as his eyes had been. It pulsated once with energy, before dulling back to normal, the color staying the same. Jack stared at it, breathing heavily and clutching his chest. In his reflection, his eyes were back to their normal hazel. He looked up to see the woman watching him. Her eyes were bright with a new wonder. "He was right," she breathed. Who was? What was that?" Jack choked out, but even as he asked, the pieces were falling into place. The sword, the lake, how there was no way he could have survived having been in the icy water for as long as he remembered. How there was no way she could have survived in it long enough to save him. Unless she was... "You're..." The woman stood to her full height, towering over him. She walked towards him, and Jack could see that what he thought were ribbons in her hair were actually lines of watercress and plant stems flowing in a long train behind her that led back into the water. Her dress shimmered with her movements the way ripples of water caught the moonlight. Her eyes began to glow. "I have gone by many names and taken many forms over the ages. In this era, I am known as Nimue," she announced. "I am the Lady of the Lake." Jack's mouth hung open. Nimue tilted her head. She took another step closer, and Jack scrambled back on the ground until his head thumped painfully against a log. Nimue stopped. "Don't be afraid," she said. "I mean you no harm." "You're real," Jack whispered. He felt a smile breaking out on his face. Nimue seemed to pause. The corner of her mouth quirked up. "I am." Jack grinned wider, and a slightly hysterical laugh bubbled out of him. Then the legends, the knights, the Round Table, Camelot. Magic. Nimue only smiled in answer. Jack laughed again and ran a hand through his hair. He was right all along. This world was, and still is, filled with magic. They're real, he said to himself again. You're a peculiar one, Jack, Nimue mused. So I've been told, Jack mused. He jumped to his feet, pacing in circles. Oh man, I have so many questions. If you're real, then King Arthur must have been real too, right? And what about all the creatures? The fairies, the dragons, the giants, and all of them? Nimue chuckled. At one point, they were all true. And now? Her expression turned somber. Jack's smile fell, but then he brightened up again. But you're still here. That means it can't all be gone. He paused, remembering where he was. Why are you here? For this. With a wave of her hand, the sword rose off the ground, floating over to hover horizontally above Nimue's palms. Jack stared at it, a new recognition dawning on him. Jackson Overland, for your courage and compassion, I deem you worthy of wielding the legendary sword Excalibur, the weapon of the greatest heroes of the past. And with it, I entrust you with the duty to protect this land and its people. Nimue held out Excalibur and offered to him, her expression becoming grave. But Excalibur's powers come at a heavy cost, she warned. The more you draw from its magic, the more of your remaining time in this world you lose. Jack looked back down at Excalibur, the searing pain he had just felt still fresh in his mind. Suddenly magic didn't seem all that enticing. He took a step back. Why are you giving this to me? Nimue turned to gaze to the lake. The 9 sisters have had a vision. Darkness that hasn't been in centuries approaches us, one more powerful than that of when Camelot still stood. I fear that we will need a hero once again. Jack felt the blood drain out of his face. Darkness? What do you mean, darkness? Nimue shook her head. I am forbidden from sharing more, for we cannot interfere with the future. We? Avalon. Jack's jaw dropped. If only Emily could hear this too, but I'm flattered that you think I'm good enough, Jack said, taking a few more steps away from her. But I only saved my sister, and nearly died trying. I am not a hero. Excalibur would not have accepted you if you weren't. Jack shook his head, moving further backwards. I can't. His bare foot stepped into the lake, and all at once the memories of drowning slammed back into his mind. Suddenly he couldn't breathe again, and he stumbled forward. Nimue grabbed his arm, steadying him. She waited patiently as he gasped for air. Jack fought back the nausea building up in him. He remembered feeling as if thousands of hands were dragging him into the water. A similar feeling weighed down on him now, even on dry land. He looked back up at Nimue. She was as stoic as ever, but there was a hint of concern in her expression. Jack swallowed. Is that the only reason why you saved me? No. Even through her bright glow, Jack could see her eyes soften. Above all else, you deserve a second chance at life. And yet you're asking me to give it away. Nimue nodded. It is a heavy burden, too heavy to carry alone. Jack shook his head. I don't want it, he whispered. Nimue set the sword down and took his hand, gently helping him stand up straight. I will not force it upon you, but you were chosen for a reason, Jack. Excalibur is yours, should you accept it. Jack swallowed. Her hand was warm, solid. She was real. He was still struggling to process the fact and what it meant for everything he thought he knew, and what it meant for him. What if you've chosen wrong? Nimue tilted her head to the side, studying him. No matter how scared he was, Jack couldn't bring himself to look away. The otherworldly glow in her eyes made it seem as if she was peering into his very soul. Then she smiled, and Jack wondered what she saw. I've kept you long enough. She let go of his hand. Someone's waiting for you. Wait! Nimue's whole body glowed, turning translucent. With one last smile, she transformed into water, cascading back in with the rest of the lake. The fog around him all seemed to get drawn into the same spot where she had disappeared, and with it the scene around him until he was engulfed in darkness once again. Jack gasped, sitting upright. He was back on the ground, which was now covered in snow again. The sun had barely changed its position near the horizon. Had it all been a dream? Then he saw the frozen lake and the hole in the ice. His clothes were still dry, and yet he shuddered violently at the fresh memories of the freezing water and moved to wrap his arms around himself. That's when his hand bumped into something metal. Dread built in his gut. Excalibur lay in the snow next to him, its scabbard beside it. The light from the setting sun shone bright off its blade and illuminated the blue gemstone in the pommel. A different kind of chill ran through him, settling into his core. It was real. There was a broken gasp behind him.
Jack?
Jack whipped around. Emily was standing on the hill. She was covering her mouth with her hands, tears spilling down her cheeks. Jack scrambled to his feet, kicking up extra snow to hide Excalibur from view. Running close behind her was their mother, who, upon spotting him, froze in place beside her. Seeing the two of them together, Jack was hit with the full force of something else Nimue had told him.
You deserve a second chance at life.
Jack felt his own eyes tear up as well, and he let out a wet laugh. He opened and closed his mouth a few times, then pressed his lips together in a smile and nodded. With that, the spell was broken. His mother and Emily ran down the hill, all but tackling him into an embrace. They sank to their knees, desperately holding on to Jack as if he would disappear if they let go. Jack hugged them back, his shoulders shaking. Emily buried her face in his shirt.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry,
she kept repeating in between sobs. Jack's heart ached. He pressed a kiss on her head.
You have nothing to be sorry for, he reassured her. I'm so glad you're safe. I'd do it again in a heartbeat.
His mother laughed in relief. She took his face in her hands.
How is this possible?
She whispered. Jack faltered. What could he tell them? The truth? They would never believe him. But then again, how else would he explain how he'd miraculously returned from the dead, safe and completely dry, as if he'd never fallen through the ice in the first place? He glanced at where Excalibur was hidden in the snow. Maybe if he showed them proof. Nimbus' warning flashed through his mind again.
Darkness that hasn't been seen in centuries approaches us. I fear that we will need a hero once again.
He couldn't bring his family into this with him. In the end, he shook his head, at a loss for words. Whatever his mother saw in his expression made her eyes soften. She stroked his cheeks with her thumbs.
My sweet, brave boy, she said. I'm so proud of you.
That finally broke him. Tears streamed down Jack's cheeks, warm against the biting cold, and his body racked with sobs. Emily and his mother hugged him again, and he clung onto them as he cried.